So let's do a quick demonstration. Now, I mentioned that you can use the web portal, like the old school way. Not bad school, just old school. So what I'll do here is I'm going to authenticate into CyberArk as a user called John. Now, you saw a whole bunch of different authentication methods. Earlier, I talked about the concept of inherited multi-factor. This comes in really handy with things like mainframes, for instance, that don't lend themselves so well to MFA. But John logs in. Then, based on who he is, he has access to a number of those accounts that are vaulting and rotating. If he wants to say connect with, say, a domain admin one, he finds it, presses the connect button, maybe goes through an approval process if we want him to. This one's more open, tells us why he needs it, but then tells us where he wants to go. It's a one-to-many account, so you can either A, let users select, or B, lock it down. So you can only go to this target or that target or that target. But John clicks go. We'll then start that session creation process, right? So we didn't see what the password was. We programmatically connect him through CyberArk, so our jump server, reach up, grab the secret internally. You see he's notified he's being recorded, and I have this in a window, but most users will prefer it to be maximized. I did this because we were presenting at an organization that only had a 1024 by 768 projector, which still does happen. But he's connected as that admin account. Didn't see the password, could be 90 characters long, no big deal. We, of course, have isolated him. We're also monitoring what he's doing and can apply analytics, but I'll talk more about the analytics in a future session. What I'll do, though, is I'm going to do something nice and just turn on the Windows firewall profile. What you'll see in a bit is I can actually tell you it was John who did this operation. Log in, click connect, go cat go. Yes, sir.
So John's logged in, and the machine, he's idle for a little bit, and the screen locks itself.
Sure.
He comes back. Oh, enter your password.
So, a couple of options. The first is we can instantiate session max time. So if he's idle for a little while, we'll go ahead and disconnect him. Second is if he needed, say if it was locked or he needed to re-authenticate or for whatever reason he just wanted to reconnect, simply close, access again. The re-authentication will cancel any screen timeouts or anything like that for him.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let's say I'm on a support call with Microsoft or whatever vendor, and they want to hop on to my computer and also see what I'm doing. Do you somehow block that access or disallow them to use some sort of remote control? Because I don't see it be there any logging from that point.
So good question. If I have an over-the-shoulder type of use case, I'm not going to block that from occurring. Right? The user is authenticated successfully through CyberArk using whatever process we've set. I trust the user enough to leverage that account. Now, it is within the realm of possibility to be able to allow a user to connect, but also be doing endpoint controls to block specific remote connectivity clients so they couldn't do something like this. But most of our customers will instantiate control here and allow the user to make a decision of leveraging something like a Microsoft over the shoulder or something like that. But it is definitely possible, even though we do see it on the rarer side of things. Remote connections like that work fabulously when they work. But sometimes a user will have to see a password. So for us, that means allowing it if you choose, but also doing things like one-time use, as I mentioned earlier. So John tries to use his admin account. We change it after an hour. I'm on East Coast time here. That's why you're seeing the difference in time zone there. But we'll actually rotate that secret after John uses it or after he checks it back in. So that exclusive access is also possible here too. We mentioned ServiceNow. So maybe in order to show that password or use it, John has to actually put a ticket into your ticketing system. As long as that ticketing system has an API, you can do that. We can validate if the ticket exists, if it's set to the correct priority, if it's been approved, if the user specified the color blue, whatever logical parameters we choose are possible through this.
So you have an audit perspective to enforce that with ServiceNow.
Was that?
You have an enforcement mechanism to enforce that for something like ServiceNow.
Yep. So you actually tell us this account, this flow needs to be approved within ServiceNow.
Okay.
We then reach out via API, check and validate, and then you choose, you can either A, put more approval flows on CyberArk afterwards, or B, just use ServiceNow as the element of trust. Yes?
So you have the validation piece, but do you also have like non-validated reasons? So say you just want to report back the reason why somebody is accessing them.
Definitely, and this also includes emergency access as well. There are cases where putting in a ticket is going to take way too long. So emergency flows, those break glass, red button type flows are also supported through this process too.
So I saw on there when it had the reason was optional. Do you have the ability from an audit point of view to make that required?
Oh yeah, or have a specific set of reasons that need to be entered
Yep.
through a drop-down list. That's all possible.
Okay.
Is there like in the system? I'm just trying to think of like compliance questions at the moment because compliance is important. But I'm just thinking, like, is there for the password policies and the requirements? Is there a way to like align with this framework or that framework, or is it something you manually choose what needs to be the requirement for the passwords?
Great question. Within, in terms of password management, we don't have like a compliance drop-down. We do for reporting capabilities, specifically for our endpoint stuff.
Yeah.
But the typical flow will be, we'll set a baseline compliance policy. Passwords must rotate every 180 days. Then for specific platforms, which can be duplicated, we may have a PCI platform that has this rotation requirement, a non-PCI platform that has another, but that is specified when you're actually setting up the platform
Oh,
itself.
neat. Okay. And then that's actually, I like the way you do that. And then the other question I had was for. So I guess you kind of answered that. So when you're setting up the platforms or whatever, you can set up like the really silly platforms that decide you can't have over this amount of character length or something like that. So I guess you would customize that when you're setting it up then, eh?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Character length, we can only
there-
connect using these clients.
Yeah.
Or
Is there
these hours.
is there a like in the dashboard kind of view, however it looks, is there like a way that says kind of prioritizes like these ones are secure and it allows us to obviously follow these standards, but these ones they're not as secure, but the reason is because of the restrictions of like, can you kind of mention that in your dashboard? I'm just trying to think of how you'd present
It's
it.
done in two areas. There's a comment on the actual secrets themselves,
Yeah.
But there's also a report that comes back with the compliance status showing you, based on the specifics of this platform, 90 days rotation versus your company's 180,
Yeah.
here are the things that are out of compliance for that particular
That's
business
really
system.
neat, actually. That would be a really good like overview for, especially for the compliance officers and that. Especially, I'm thinking like GDPR and
definitely.
data protection officers and all those fun people.
And GDPR specifically, there are cases where these recordings, that session you saw, it makes its way back to the vaults.
Yeah.
But should it? Should it leave the country or municipality where it was recorded and head back to the vault? Well, some people say no, so we can actually store them locally to the recorded environment versus always having to pipe them back. So
Well, yeah, there are requirements where we can't do that, so that makes sense. Interesting. Okay, I like it.
So let's switch gears. Windows, we connected. Let's show a different type of account really quick, and we won't spend too long on it. But I have a root account managed, but this could be Enable. This could be a SysDB account on Oracle. It could be a sys account on a mainframe. But going through the browser, John clicks the connect button. We let him know he's being recorded down there in the bottom and drop him into a PuTTY session. And it's kind of hard to read there because it's not John's PuTTY session. It's one that we're presenting back to him. Now, as part of the flow, we actually performed a su to root and authenticated automatically. So if you can't get there as root because you block that by corporate policy, we simply handle that for the user. Now, the reason why this is kind of suspect, in my opinion, is even though it allows for things like exporting for your Oracle administrators, it isn't very native to Unix, right? We connected through a browser, open up an RDP file, and yeah, it was automatic, but then we dropped John into a PuTTY session that isn't his own. For me, I would say, no. There are so many areas of sacrilegiousness there that I don't want to do it. So I mentioned native access earlier. It simply has to exist. Now, while John may have been okay with that flow, maybe Bob wasn't. So if Bob wants to connect right from his terminal, all he needs to do is modify his SSH connection string to say, hi, my name is Bob. I want to connect as the root account for this system. So he's actually pulling it from CyberArk, and I want to go through this intermediary. It's our SSH proxy here. Bob is asked to authenticate. Bob is also configured for multi-factor. So I'm actually going to have it sent to Bob's phone, which I have conveniently stolen here. Before my authentication, Bob gets connected through almost as if he was going through the browser without having to leave his console.
And in the recording, the input as well as the output is recorded.
Absolutely. Okay. And you'll see a quick example of this when we look at the audit side of things. Now, we developed this functionality around 5 years ago, and Unix users and network admins were like, yes, this is fantastic. And then Windows users and everybody else said, oh, what about us? I am happy to say this flow is supported through any remote desktop aggregator. So as long as you can launch a graphical session through a modified start program string, we connect a user through, get them connected, go cat go, right from something like MSTSC or RDCM. Yes, sir.
How about PowerShell, Windows PowerShell?
Yep. So the question is PowerShell operating in a human capacity or non-human? If it's human, we can authenticate them through the proxy from, say, remote desktop aggregators and drop them into a PowerShell session. If it's a non-human process, the user does have the ability to programmatically pull a secret from CyberArk for a more native experience. And I'll show you that pull in our next session.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, this looks like it's not only just an authentication proxy, but an actual proxy because you connect from your CyberArk instance.
Yep.
So all connections look like they come from the vault, not from the host machine.
Yep. So we'll pass through information about the host IP for connections, but the actual connection itself is made from whatever intermediary we're connecting through, the jump server. We've seen customers use this for adding additional network level authentication controls into regulated environments. So you can only connect if you're coming from jump server 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or whatever it may be. Now, I do want to show you, because I know there was a little bit of interest, I want to show you the native approach. So I'll actually just authenticate here to a hosted environment. Looks like it logged me out. I think I got the right one. I did not get the right one. We'll try the other one. So for my user, what do you prefer in the room? AWS, Twitter? Does it matter?
Azure.
Azure.
AWS.
I don't have Azure. I'm an AWS guy, and of course you choose Azure. Any preference?
AWS.
AWS, okay.
Yeah, why not?
So let's say I want to leverage, say, either a vaulted root account or maybe a privileged IAM user. I could go through the browser and do the exact same flow I showed you before, but why? In this case, I'm using my own user's browser here. Let me maximize that so it looks a little better. All I need to do is modify my username syntax here. So I'm going to say my name is Nita. I would like to use a vaulted and rotating, in this case, IAM account called PSM Cloud. Now, Nita has to type in her CyberArk password here. So she's authenticating back to the CyberArk solution itself. Types it in. We actually pull that PSM Cloud account from CyberArk, get her logged in with it without her needing to see or know what that password was. This is our privileged session manager for Cloud Proxy to add to the native access of the user. You had a question?
Yeah, and I may have missed this earlier, but does CyberArk use multi-factor authentication for getting into that interface at all?
Definitely can, yes.
can.
So multi-factor authentication can and should be placed in front of these authentication flows. If you rely only on, say, Active Directory or LDAP trust, and that trust is broken, you've now also broken your trust of the CyberArk platform too. So I cannot recommend highly enough put MFA in front of CyberArk as the first thing you do after deployment.
So you support Amazon in this instance, but we're questionable as far as Azure or GCP?
So Azure is coming here in the next couple weeks to a month. GCP, while it is quickly coming, most of our customers are on AWS or Azure.
Sure.
But yes, there are plans to support Google Cloud Platform with the same flow. And this is only for the native access, right? You can go through the browser and get to whatever SaaS-based platform you want without necessarily using the super native flow that I've shown you here. Yes, sir.
So was AWS querying the vault like in an S3 bucket somewhere, or how did that? Where was the vault stored when you did that?
Good question. So we're actually connecting through a proxy here. So the user's browser in this case is using a pack file to route traffic to AWS through CyberArk. So we're intercepting it at the proxy layer. There's no AWS controls
So
there.
you're okay. So, got it.
Now, the cool part about that, and I know you got a question, I'll address it in a moment,
No,
but before I
it was
forget.
the same question.
Okay, same question, cool. The cool thing about that is it gives us the ability to also perform access controls or application shaping. So for instance, if a guy uses my, my vaulted Twitter account, I'll go ahead and type in my password correctly. Same flow as before, but we can actually track to see what tweets he likes. So, for instance, who doesn't like happy little puppies? What folks he follows, but also do things like prevent certain things from being tweeted. For instance, my password is don't look. We can actually intercept that traffic, stop the tweet from containing password from actually being
What
tweeted.
does it say?
Does it It says my password is 1234.
How do you
No, the
do this
the
with
pop-up
the
message.
mobile,
Yeah, that's good.
like the app on the phone?
Yep, so at the moment, this doesn't support the app flow. It's simply for browser-based access too. So if you're using an app, that is something we're looking into, but not something that's
And
supported
this is all
at this
just
time.
proxy-based?
Yep, it's all proxy-based. Yep, yes.
So does this also work with like third-party web apps like TweetDeck, or is it just the native Twitter.com?
Just the native today, but we are looking into third parties, things like that. Again, we don't want to control all Twitter access, but the privileged stuff to the company Twitter account that can cause the most reputational damage here.
So back to like another audited question for this. When you're talking about being able to track who follows what, likes what, intercept the traffic to prevent passwords, how far does that tracking mechanism go? For to Zoe's point of GDPR, GDPR talks about being able to track access and the reasoning for access to certain data elements.
Oh, yeah.
How does that work with either maybe a different type of SIM or integration with something maybe like a Splunk, as far as the auditing capabilities go?
Completely user-defined.
Okay.
So we choose how long we'd like to retain the information within CyberArk and whether or not we want to forward this on to, say, a Splunk or another SIM or syslog solution. So there's no theoretical limit to CyberArk. It's simply based on whatever policies we choose to set upon the implementation and after the implementation, too.
Okay. Do you see a lot of people using CyberArk to address some of those compliance concerns with the new privacy acts coming up?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very, very common.
Is there, I think it's a random question, but I've seen it so often on Twitter, I just can't stop laughing. But is there any like ability to read like, basically I've seen a lot of like credit card details and bank details of people on Twitter and driver's license that. Is there any way to like limit that, or is it simply kind of only text that I can?
So at the moment, we're looking at text because we're actually scraping the input, but
Yeah.
it can also be things like, for instance, in AWS, stopping an EC2 instance, it doesn't say, well, stop it, we don't pull that, we actually pull the action itself. So because we're intercepting the traffic, there are some neat things we can do.
Yeah.
However, it's something that's still, I think, currently being worked on. So the answer is, yes, it is within the realm of possibility, and any suggestions from both the room as well as out there, please send them to us. We're always looking for new ways to instantiate this new technology.
And then the I saw on the C3 Alliance you have Splunk. Do you have an app that integrates with Splunk to send the data, or do you have to send it over like syslog and that sort of stuff?
So it's done primarily via syslog,
Okay.
but there's special dashboards, things like that exist in Splunk Enterprise.
Okay,
Market
so there
with
is an
vendors, so
app.
you can actually correlate the info.
Yeah.
The other element of integration is, and you'll see this in a little bit, I hope we'll be able to see it, we actually pull information in from Splunk too
Oh, do you?
to apply
Okay.
to our analytics.
Oh, that's
so
quite
it's
cool.
multi-directional, and that's true of most of the big SIM vendors, so your
Yeah.
ArcSight, your LogRhythm, LogLogic, Splunk,
Okay.
folks like that.
And so for setting it up for Splunk, I'm just trying to picture that. So is it still quite hands-on where you need a Splunk architect to be able to configure it properly?
So once we're piping in the syslog information, if we're using, say, the dashboard that's available, we instantiate it, we're good to go. Now, performing additional correlation, performing any piping, multiple SINs, I would recommend having someone at the company who's familiar with Splunk to help you set up that flow. But
Oh,
the
it is
initial
very
integration, we just need to know where to send it and what format to send it in.
Brandon, you hopped over to AWS and you hopped back out really quick. I was hoping you were going to get there. Can you talk about ephemeral instances and secret control on those?
Sure. So if we're looking at ephemeral EC2, one of the biggest issues that we have is, well, how do I know when it poofs into being and when it poofs out of being? So what we've done is through, and we've actually open sourced this integration too. We integrate with CloudWatch to, we have a Lambda function that when it detects a new instance that pops up, we programmatically vault and rotate the SSH key initially.
Okay.
If it poofs down, we can of course instantiate automation, archival flows. The concept of delete does not exist within CyberArk. We will not remove a secret until after the audit retention policy has expired. So when you click delete, it puts it into an archive state until the appropriate amount of time has passed. I learned that the hard way in the very beginning of my CyberArk employment, where I did some silly things and thought I could just erase the audit log. I could not.
The instance and perception of the jump box is limited to a single box, or can it be instantiated from multiple different boxes pretending to be jump boxes?
Very, very few of our customers will deploy with one unless they have the world's flattest environment.
Sure.
So we may start with one too, but even then, We want to make sure with load balancing as well. If it
Well,
goes down.
and I 1 versus 2 versus thousands and stuff like that. And
yeah.
the kind of the direction I go on that is, let's say we're doing the SSH, we're connecting in, we're running commands and such like that. Then I'm going to do an SCP. I want to transfer some data using that mechanism for. And now suddenly Darktrace and other AI machine learning type systems are then saying you're doing a lot of exfiltration of data that's going from this jump box out to. Really, it doesn't necessarily know because it doesn't have the insight into that unless you also have a kind of integration point where it can kind of draw the lines separate and it doesn't just see everything going from the jump box going to everywhere else.
Good question. So we want to make sure we're using encrypted protocols whenever possible, at least on the front end. Sometimes we have to connect to mainframes using Telnet, and it makes me cringe every time. But we also want to make sure that the jump boxes themselves, we look at as tier 0 security appliances and access appliances too. So both CyberArk analytics as well as additional analytics and security must be placed on these jump servers too. Whenever we concentrate access across 1,000 systems down to access potentially coming from 10, we simply have to keep those 10 visible. So I definitely agree that because they're more visible, because they're centralized, we need to perform additional security controls on top. Yes?
You can go first if you want.
All right. The load balancing part, is that something you provide, or do you work with someone like F5 to provide the load balancing?
Good question. So many of our customers will leverage external load balancing through F5 or NetScaler, for instance. Some will choose to use things like remote desktop app connection pooling. So CyberArk does provide recommendations, but we actually leave it open enough to where we can use whatever model exists in the company today. But most people, though, will use an external load balancer. Yes?
I just have another thing about accessing the authentication. So I know that you can set it up where, we explained earlier, where you can assign access to certain shared credentials based on like policies and that. Is there any restriction of like these credentials are only available to that user, even if somebody has full admin access, they still can't see them? Is there any ability to do that?
And actually, while we were chatting, I logged into CyberArk as a user called Brandon.
Yeah.
In my environment, he's me. So of course he has access to a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
Not such a good idea. So we're firm advocates of distributing that administration, where my Vault admin should be responsible for maybe the care and feeding of the Vault, the initial security policy settings, but shouldn't be able to access every single credential within. So
Yeah.
those safes I mentioned earlier, you can have different users and groups with administrative rights there versus having one super all-powerful, built for compromised user that should they win the lottery, now we lost all that admin level access. So
Well,
we
yeah.
want to kind of pair it out for sure.
I'm also thinking of like if an organization is going to deploy this, for example, a lot of times one thing that's really attractive right now is an organization that, for example, a password manager
Sure.
can give their employees access to it to use for both personal and corporate.
Sure.
But obviously the personal means that even if you leave the company, I'll delete it, but I never have access to it.
Right.
So that would be quite neat. I like those restrictions. Also, I think I don't know if that counts as personal information under GDPR, but there are definitely restrictions where you shouldn't have access to certain things.
Sure. So single user safes are incredibly common. Whereas an administrator, I might know that it exists, but I have
can't-
access to nothing within.
Good.
It's a very common platform. Yep.
Lovely.
So just to kind of to put I guess a cherry on top of the session here, this user Brandon has access to some of the audit information that went through the platform. Remember, John connected earlier as a domain admin account and performed some tasks. Here I can see that occurred, where he went. I can view the recorded session if I'd like to. Skip identical frames, head to the part that I care about. It's all available should we have access to performing some of these audit capabilities.
It's just the replay within that window. It's so anything that's happening outside of it, you're discarding.
Good question. We actually record all of the user windows, but it is blanked out. So only the active element is recorded, but should they move the session to their second, third, fourth, fifth monitor, we'll actually keep recording, and users have the ability to zoom in to the action so they don't have this little string of stuff they have to try and piece out. But we want to make sure that if users are moving stuff around, we're still able to audit that.
So in that context, though, the fourth and fifth screens will also have all the data being collected, but technically blacked out.
Yeah, they just look blank, exactly.
But so it looks black, but is it actually blacked out?
It is. So what's happening is we're recording at the jump server layer. So I have no knowledge of what's happening on the end user system past the application that's being presented to that end user. So we're not tracking, what they're doing in Notepad or Sublime or whatever else. It's just what element is being presented to them through that session.
Okay.
So it's removed, not redacted.
Not even in this case. It's not even.
Because that was the confusion that I was having.
Not even pulled.
So when let's say we're recording a session from an admin account, and they have something on screen that would be considered classified as a PII of some sort, or maybe even a PCI card. That session's recorded. Is that and that's sent to the jump box? How is that just done through HTTPS?
It's actually done through CyberArk's proprietary encrypted protocol. So we're transferring the information back using an encrypted challenge and response process, storing it in an encrypted state using that hierarchical model that I mentioned earlier. Now the question becomes, if users are actually typing in PII, maybe a database administrator, should we do keystroke logging? Probably not. So in areas where we've got incredibly critical information, we don't have to do the full audit payload. We can pare that back a little bit, even choose to not audit at all, simply use it for the isolation capability.
Can you pull up the SSH session that you were in?
Definitely.
I was just curious, is that just a log or is that actually, it's just a log?
Yeah, so what I can do is, this was the one I went through with a proxy. We can actually recompile the standard in and out to actually make it look to the end user or the administrator like a video. So we've got the keystroke log, but we can also present it in a more video-ish state if the user prefers that.
Mm-hmm. So going back to that, if you're saying we don't have to record the keystrokes, but we're still recording the screen. So if they're typing in sensitive data, and obviously the new CCPA is extending what PII means, so that can be very troubling with admin accounts when you're recording them or what have you. So now your screen capture would be considered sensitive and protected underneath a regulation like CCPA. Well, another challenge with that would now be it has to be discoverable. So if you're asked to provide what data you have on that user, now the screen capture comes into play as discoverable, and it's something you have to report on. What kind of challenges do you see with that, or what is CyberArk doing to assist with that that challenge?
So I mentioned the concept of a platform earlier. These platforms also handle information like what's recorded potentially, what clients people can use. So during the initial implementation, we'll say, okay, what sort of regulation are we dealing with here? What considerations should we make? So that now we've got it labeled to where if we do have the reporting requirement, it's less of a needle in the haystack type operation. And I can say, show me Brandon's access on all PCI, for instance, related systems, or all in-compliant related systems too. The other element of that is, you mentioned video. We could just have something like keystroke logging without video, but again, if a user is entering in a password, I want to be able to parse that out. So for a number of platforms, we actually do have logic that will automatically redact that information if you choose to enable it, like a user entering in a password over SSH.
So it has the ability to see that that's a password field and pull it out. Okay, so we're in California, so the California Privacy Act talks to names, full names being PII on its own. So do you have the ability to do the same thing? So now you can block out that screen recording. So if you go into that tool and say, I need to find a screen recording that someone's typing in a name, do you have the ability to report out on that kind of granularity?
That's a good thought, no. As it stands, if the user just puts in a plain text name like Brandon, if I'm not looking at a field or a database table or something like that, we would just be doing a text search. However, if there's any kind of identifying element, name that exists in users underscore names table, then I could potentially pull that if we're tracking the appropriate information.
Okay.
But one of the things is we do this agentlessly, so we are relying on the information going through the proxy. It is possible to get more granular with the agent-full elements of the solution, but as it stands with this, we would need to rely on some other identifying metric to find.
Okay, so you could identify a database as customer data A, and you could go through the process of identifying what those fields may be to help with that reporting aspect.
And you'll catch the database from the connection flow. Normally when you connect to a database host, you have to specify the database. So I'll know that info. So if there's a names database or a PI database, well now I've completely isolated the area I want to look, then it's a matter of performing searches, not watching every video unless you absolutely want to.
Do you have a mechanism for post-redaction if necessary, if some data was actually identified?
Yep, so while it isn't possible to modify the recordings because they are immutable, it is possible to perform protection or even archival of the recordings too. Redaction, in a lot of cases, if we do have critical information, is handled through permissioning.
Immutable but deletable?
So the delete of, say, an account itself can be done. Recordings themselves, they're not deleted until they're expired. So after a certain amount of time, say you're retaining for 180 days, then we're done. The only existence of that recording will be in the backups that you may
You
have
can't
performed previously.
delete or expire out of band, basically.
There's
to
no
say
deletion
that
or
expired
expiring
just this
out
one.
of band. Nope.
Well, how does that work with GDPR and the right to be forgotten? If you've got information on there, you can't delete it.
Yep, so good question there. A lot of cases when we're looking at GDPR specific requirements, these are not personal accounts, so we're accessing corporate data with potentially a shared account too. So while it is possible to look at offlining or offloading the GDPR stored recordings at the site of record, that still is information about shared accounts we're dealing with. If users are going through the proxy without leveraging a vaulted credential or it is personal, a lot of folks with GDPR compliance will not store session recordings in that case. They'll simply leverage us as a proxy alone.
Okay.
Now, there are a number of different nuances that I didn't touch on there, but that's the gist. We want to make sure that if we are under something specific like GDPR compliance, we're making sure to do the appropriate level of consulting before deploying rather than needing to look at remediation after the fact.
So this is a situation where you really need to hire an expert to deploy it properly.
And this is actually something that CyberArk offers. So
Yeah,
we
okay.
perform the consulting as well as the implementation too.
Do you have something similar to Splunk where it's like you can do the Splunk architecture certification so then you can then go and deploy it in other places? But do you have it in CyberArk?
Yep,
Okay.
tiers of CyberArk certifications from just being kind of familiar and friendly with the concept to actually being able to deploy the solution itself. All that's handled through
That's interesting.
our formal certification process,
Okay, cool.
which they won't let CyberArk internal employees take. Or they just told me I couldn't take it. In any case, it's definitely something that is held in very high regard for us, for sure.
Interesting.
Are you implementing some algorithms, compression mechanisms for the videos,
We are.
Because most of other solutions require huge storages. And
So we do
people cannot
implement-
afford that cost only for the compliance.
Oh, yeah. So we do implement compression. Your typical Windows session will tend to run around 250 to 300 kilobytes per minute. The Unix session you just saw, it's negligible, it's 3K. So typically what we'll do in the beginning is we'll look at the amount of sessions, number average per day. We'll then generate a formula to determine storage. I can say the largest deployment I've scoped, I recommended to them 5 terabytes of storage, and we were talking about tons of sessions with a very long retention policy. This also means that you will have to have a codec to play them outside of CyberArk if you have download rights, but we provide the codec, and really with VNC, things like that, or VLC rather, you don't really necessarily need the codec. But yes, we do perform compression. We also drop identical frames, so we account for them in terms of time, but not for space.
And you can send it off to like an offsite type of repository or shared storage, NFS or some other type of protocol, or
Yep, absolutely. So there is the option to store them locally at the vault or via network attached storage or locally to the jump server if we're dealing with GDPR.
and that's where you can accidentally delete things. I mean, well,
It's true. It's true. You can't actually delete things out there. There's I only have so much oversight for sure.
The time information is inside the video, right?
Yep, so time information is actually part of the metadata stored with the recording
Okay,
itself.
great.
So you actually see all that information here. Also,
sorry.
these events, right, they're all timestamped too as they're sent over to whatever syslogging we're doing.
And how long are these videos stored? Are they stored indefinitely, or is it on a per customer basis?
It's based on the group of systems, but it's whatever the customer decides. So we default something like, I think it's 180 days, but that can be changed depending on what we're dealing with.
and
So
you
yeah,
can
it's
change it on a
different.
per machine basis.
So it can be per machine. We'll typically see it done via groups of machines.
Oh, generally
So
policy,
doing
but
lots
like,
of-
oh,
Yeah,
these
you
other
can have a
ones are
single
more
machine
important.
too.
I need 10 years on this,
Yep.
but I only need 90 days on that.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you can
Absolutely.
align it with a retention schedule.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yes,
You keep saying, I keep hearing the words out of your mouth, proprietary
Code.
CyberArk proprietary protocols.
yes.
Do you roll your own cryptography, or are you using standard cryptography to secure connections when you're transmitting these secrets?
So it is standard crypto. So it's not CyberArk proprietary crypto. It's simply a CyberArk proprietary method for leveraging the crypto. So for instance, most vaults exist AES 256-bit encrypted. When we're dealing with CyberArk traffic to and from, we leverage the same encryption stack, or if users want CyberArk components to communicate over TLS, it can be changed. The proprietary part is the challenge response process that goes into authenticating. So every CyberArk component has a rotating credential it uses to authenticate and leveraging the API for the transfers and things like that. So not proprietary encryption. We're using industry standards.
Just wanted to clear
proprietary
that up.
method for implementing that
So
encryption.
standard TLS handshake when there's a connection, but the challenge
choose, yes.
response is the proprietary part.
Exactly.
And the shared secret are secretly generated by the software itself, or you have a standard?
Yep, so secrets for intermediate connections are generated by the software itself. The initial vault encryption secrets, while they can be generated by CyberArk before the install, most of our customers will perform a re kind of encrypting process upon deployment to ensure that there are no copies of that encryption key and stack existing anywhere outside of that deployment.
Okay, so you do in the first installation the initial seed, so the generation like for SSH.
And while we will generate a random seed for them initially, most of our customers still want to make the extra level of control to do it upon implementation too.
And we don't run into any weird export problems.
So the weirdest export problem is, let's say they've lost the initial recovery key. They don't.
Oh no, I'm talking
initial
about
reply.
encryption algorithm type of export problems.
Nope, don't typically
France
have a
back
lot
in
of
the
export
day.
problems.
Yep.
Obviously, anything is within the scope of being, but it's not something we encounter on the day-to-day. We do have a number of services that can help with things like malformed data, things like forgotten keys, stuff like that, but it is used very sparingly, as CyberArk is considered a tier 0 system, so we want a lot of oversight on
Well,
that.
I meant specifically government type export, trying to bring this into Iran, bring this into certain countries where we're now
that
allowed to
type
do
of
certain
export.
that kind of export.
Yes.
All good answers though on each of the parts leading up to that. But
So while I can't speak on the policies of individual countries, I can say there are kind of policies in place for places that we are allowed to do business with that may be something along the lines of, say, for a specific municipality, data can't leave or data can't enter. You may have a segmented environment just for that environment versus a shared global architecture. So yes, there are considerations, but these are things we encounter with, it's not as often, but with great confidence behind some of the processes we've put in place to handle it before.
So like in a multi-master distributed model where you're doing this internationally and such, and you've got jump boxes for these certain geos, or you want to connect to a certain asset and it's driven in a different geo, what's the replication mechanism between those master vaults and isolated vaults as necessary or such like that?
So it's either everything or certain what we call safes. So it doesn't have to be all the stuff, but it happens over port 1858. That's our kind of secret sauce port. The encryption is based on either A, inline, right? So if I'm connecting to a system that exists in another continent, as long as I've got kind of a network pipe over, I can replicate things like secrets and audit information as they occur. For bigger stuff, it just takes a little while, but it's all done over that same one port, one protocol.
What's
for
the frequency
replication.
of that replication?
60 minutes if we're looking at the asynchronous replication, but it can always be changed. Now, I know there's some additional questions, but what I do want to do is I want to talk a little bit about applications. We'll do that in the next session, so we will move on with the time we've had left. But in summary, vaulting and rotation, isolation and monitoring, native access, as well as analytics. We talked about that on the top end, but being able to take action on these events as they occur, be able to notify of weird activities or terminate sessions, these are all part of the core CyberArk platform.